Your ideas sound brilliant in your head, but do they confuse readers when you write them down? Well, after 10 years as an English professor and writing coach, I've found that even the simplest ideas can be made to sound complex, and even the most complex ideas can be made to sound simple. It's not actually your ideas that confuse readers. It all comes down to the way that you structure them. So in this video, I'm going to show you the coffee stain problem, which is why readers can get so confused by your ideas even when they ring clear in your own mind. Then I'm going to give you the experience of readers as they work their way through your text. And finally, I'm going to show you 3 types of structure in your writing. 1 that you're already using, which you should probably stop using, and 2 that you can start using today. But first, why is it that we writers fail to recognize the patterns in our own writing that cause difficulty with readers? Well, think about whatever happens whenever you're trying to diagnose and fix problems in your own writing. You've written a draft and now you're looking it over, or maybe you have given it to a reader, you've got some feedback, and now you're going through giving some corrections to it. And so what do you do here? Well, here's what you think happens. All right, you take your draft and your draft has all these words on it. And so you look at those words and you know the meaning of those words and you're the one who arranged those words in that order. And so those words in that order give you a certain meaning. And then you check, you say, all right, does this meaning that I interpret in this text correspond to the meaning that I intend, the one that I want to express? And you say, aha, yes, perfect. That's exactly what I want to express. That's what many of us think is happening in the proofreading and revision process. But what's really happening here is what's called the coffee stain problem. And here's why it fails readers. So imagine this. You wake up one morning and you're getting ready to write and you pour yourself a cup of coffee when suddenly a great idea strikes you. And so you rush to your desk, you set down your coffee cup, you reach for your pen, and in all your excitement to start writing, you knock over your coffee cup. And so now coffee is staining the paper that you were going to write on. So although this paper has no words on it, that stain, that particular shape and the depth and the color and everything, it will still serve to remind you of the idea that you had when you made that stain. The problem here is when you hand this stained paper off to readers. That stain would mean nothing to a reader because they weren't there in the room with you when you had the idea. All they have is a blank sheet of paper with a certain shape and pattern of your coffee stain on it. In other words, those patterns mean nothing to your reader. They can't use it to reconstruct the idea that you had whenever you created that stain. The stain will always remind you of the brilliant idea that you had, but it will never remind readers because they weren't there with you when you had the idea. So the point of this thought experiment is really just to show the difficulty of editing our own work. Like when you look at your own text, you're not actually reading it. You're just remembering it. When you wrote the text, you had an idea in your mind, and then you chose a series of words in a particular order in order to convey that idea. So whenever you look at those words in that order again, what you're trying to do is see whether those words correspond to the idea that you had. And of course they do, because you're the one who chose the words. So in other words, what we call proofreading and editing is not really reading and interpretation. It's more about association and remembering the ideas that you already had. But if you can never stand outside yourself to get beyond your own associations and experience the text as your reader will, then how can we ever edit our own work? How can you ever predict whether a particular piece of writing is going to work for readers? Well, what you need to do is learn the structures and the structural locations where readers expect to find particular pieces of information. And you can experience this right now. So let me show you how this works. I'm going to read a series of numbers for you. And what I'd like you to do is just predict the next number in the series. That's it. Now, I know I'm breaking the fourth wall here, and I'm actually reaching out and asking you to do something, but I promise it'll be worth it. So I'm gonna read you 6 numbers, and I'll give you a little pause, but I recommend pausing the screen if you need another chance. And what I'd like you to do is just predict the next number in the series. All right, so here's the first series. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. The next number in the series is 17. All right, here's the next series. Predict the last number. 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. The next number in the series is 34. All right, last series. 2, 3, 5, 9, 4, 3. The last number in the series is 2. Now, in case you guessed any of those wrong and you're looking for an explanation, the first series was a series of prime numbers. So that's 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, and the next prime number in that series is 17. The second set of numbers comes from the Fibonacci? I've never actually heard that word said, but I think it's pronounced Fibonacci. The Fibonacci series. So you take the 2 and the 3 and you add them together and you get a 5. And then you take the 3 and the 5 together and you add them together and you get an 8. So on and so forth. And then it would be 13 plus 21 is 34. And now for that final series of numbers, did you catch the last number? Once again, it was 2359432. So did you guess the 2? Well, if you did, then congratulations, because you just guessed my mother's phone number. But if that was your mother's phone number, then the series would seem entirely coherent to you. But to anybody from outside your head, it's going to seem completely opaque. Now, they're not just going to throw up their hands and say, well, I guess there's no pattern here. What they're going to do is search for one and often provide one that you didn't intend. When you write the way that you think, you are writing according to that third sequence, which is entirely coherent to you, but opaque to readers. So how can you make your writing more coherent to readers? Is there some universal structure that we can use, some master prompt that we can give to AI? Well, unfortunately not, because that's not really how writing works. And I know this firsthand because recently I went back and reread my master's thesis, which I haven't looked at for about 10 years. And at the time, I thought this was the greatest thing that I had ever produced. It's something I worked on endlessly. I would wake up early before class and work on it, and I'd be working on it all night. And one of these things where, one of these projects where you forget to eat, you're working on it so much. So I was really absorbed in this. And by the time I handed it in, it was immaculate. It was the most perfect thing I had ever written. And of course, when I look it over now, 10 years later, I'm quite embarrassed by it. Not exactly because of the ideas, but actually because the way that the ideas are structured. I thought things were structured so clearly. I thought I had just nailed the organization. But I look over it now and there are parts of it that are honestly incomprehensible to me. But isn't that interesting? Because if coherence is part of the text, then surely when I look over this text, I would be like, well, there's the coherence, right? It was coherent when I wrote it 10 years ago. So why is it incoherent now? It's the same text, but there's essentially a different reader because I've become a different person. I've changed in that time. In other words, coherence is not a property of the text. Like we have this idea which is wrong, but we have this idea that, here's the writer and the writer, is thinking and transcribing that idea into text. And then that text gets handed off to readers. And so if the writer can make this text coherent and clear, then the reader will look at that text and they will perceive that coherence. And if that was true, then you would be able to automate this to AI and you would be able to just read over your text and fix it to apply some templates or some very kind of fixed patterns and make it coherent. However, what the experience that I had with my master's thesis shows is that coherence doesn't really work this way. It's more like this, where the idea emerges through the relationship between the writer, the reader, and the text. All these three elements are in a kind of relationship with each other, and the idea emerges from it. And so when we talk about coherence, what we're talking about is structure. And that structure doesn't exist inside the text. It's not in here. It's in the reader. And so the question of coherence is a question of how can we get this reader to perceive structure in the text? And you've already had the experience of perceiving three different kinds of structure. So what are those three kinds? Well, the last kind that you experienced with my mother's phone number was an experience of private structure. You didn't have any reference for the structure that was organizing those three elements. And so you provided one yourself. Maybe you took a guess, maybe you just got frustrated and threw your hands up and said there is no structure, but you couldn't perceive the structure. And so the kind of structure searching mechanism in your brain posited one. And that's essentially the coffee stain problem. Now, more practically, in the context of writing, that kind of structure, which is clear to the writer and opaque to the reader, is what results in a lot of meta discourse. And that's why a lot of academic prose and just really a lot of like bad writing has a lot of these signposts where writers are kind of doing two jobs at once. They're both expressing themselves and then filling in all the logical gaps and explaining to the reader how one idea follows from another. And generally, readers don't like this. It's not to say you can never do this. This is writing. You can do whatever you want. But just understand that whenever your text is organized according to your own associations in the way that makes sense to you with a disregard of the reader, you're either going to abandon the reader and they're not going to be able to use your text, or if you want them to use your text, then you're going to have to fill in all the associations and logical connections that are apparent to you but opaque to them. So it's not really a good way to go. But now the second kind of structure that you experienced was represented by the prime numbers. And that's what we would call a contextual structure because it drew on your background information. You came to the text knowing some basic things about math, and whenever you looked at the text and you saw those numbers in that sequence, you recognized it drawing on your background information from a certain kind of pattern. And that, more practically in writing, would be represented by something like genre awareness. So all readers in nonfiction are going to expect an introduction followed by some body paragraphs. If you're writing a scientific report, then you know that your readers are going to expect an introduction followed by the methods, followed by the findings, followed by the discussion. And that's not given to them in the text. They're just drawing on their background information about from seeing different versions of this kind of genre before. But now the third kind of structure that you experienced was represented by the Fibonacci sequence. And you perceived that structure not from your own background knowledge. Like you might have not even known that it was called the Fibonacci sequence, and you certainly hadn't memorized all the numbers in that sequence. You just looked at the sequence itself and the pattern kind of emerged from the text. And in your own writing, that's what we would call a textual pattern. It's not one that the reader requires any background knowledge to recognize. It's one that's provided to them from the text. And if you want a visual guide to 4 expert patterns that readers will easily recognize in your text, you can get my visual guide to expert writing. It's 4 pages long, and on this page, I have 4 examples of textual patterns with model texts taken from professional prose. So you can grab that down below the like button, or you can watch this video next because it's a deep dive into those 4 textual patterns. So be sure to go check it out.